Teachers must have a fundamental belief that man, meaning women too, we're not leaving you all out, is capable of self-improvement. Perhaps Bobby Kennedy best expressed this when he stated, "What we require is not the self-indulgence of resignation from the world, but the hard work to work out ways of fulfilling our personal concern and our personal responsibility." And I think, this is my husband's speech, and I think he really hit it when he said, it's your responsibility. Whether you're my age, 96, or whether you're 10 or 5, you have a responsibility to respect other people, to believe that people are as good as you are, and you have a great responsibility to try to learn something, so that if you ever get to be 96, you will know a little. You ain't gonna know much, but you'll know a little.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I am joined by Mr. Robert Hayden, a author of over 25 books on African American history. And thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here today.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking with you. Well, let's have that conversation.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm here with Dr. Thelma Hart-Johnson, president of the Martha's Vineyard branch of Asalh. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
My pleasure.
You ever heard of Dr. Kava? Plant scientist, botanist, educator.
I believe so, yes.
So we took the book home, and we sat on the porch, and she read the book to me. It wasn't a long book, but she read it. It was a very short book. And I was in awe. I was just amazed to hear about somebody who had taken a peanut, or peanuts, and developed chemically over 300 substances from the peanut shell, the peanut covering, and the peanut itself. And I swear to this day that I had made a decision, maybe unconsciously, but along the way, that I was going to be a George Washington Carver, that I was going to do what he had done with the peanut in his laboratory at Tuskegee Institute, which is a historically black college, as you probably know.
Tell me a little bit about the invisible lines within the community that you observed and experienced.
In my community, it was geographical invisible lines, because there was definitely areas that you knew were for African Americans or people of color, and there were communities where only whites were allowed to live. Even though you could have afford to live there, there was no such thing as crossing the color line. And we didn't necessarily have what we call we lived across the railroad tracks. It was just that certain regions were specifically for African Americans.
But I spent summers looking at ants, looking at insects, looking at flowers, because this is what Dr. Carver did. So I used to enjoy just looking at nature and looking at life. In this case, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I was born, where I lived. So that first book, that very first book, that I didn't read, but that my mother read to me, I think gave me an idea about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be George Washington Carver.
A little bit about your mother.
My mother was a grand lady, in my opinion. She stopped school when she was in 6th grade.
Wow.
And began to work to help support herself and her family. She was born, I was checking today, if she were living, she'd be 99 years old. And at the time that she stopped school at 6th grade, she began to do work as a maid and a nursemaid for white families.
If you don't mind me asking, why did you stop going to school in 6th grade?
At the time, it was normative, unfortunately, for African American youth to not have access to schooling as did whites. For an example, she told me when she was a young girl that sometimes, because there were like people who say grew string beans, they would close the African American schools, and a truck would come to the parking lot, and children would go and get on on this truck and go to pick beans for the local farmers. And as you asked me about the invisible lines, I don't think that there were any trucks pulling up to the white schools to have children get on the truck to go pick beans. So, and there were not opportunities for high schools in her community.
Wow.
I believe she told me that, for an example, in Brooksville, if you lived there, there was a neighboring town. I don't remember the town, but they would have to take a bus to a neighboring town where there was a high school, but at the time, there was not a high school or further education for African Americans in her community.
So now you have one of the books that you've written here, and could you tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book?
Mm-hmm. Well, in all of my writings, most of it, I've written about somebody else's life, biography, but I've also written autobiographies for several people who weren't able to write it, but I would do the writing for them. But in most of my books, I would say 75% of them, were based on doing oral history interviews. I going out and sitting and talking with people about their lives, about their relatives, about their experiences. So getting firsthand information for people who experience certain things and live through certain things is very important, to go to the source, because many of the people that I wanted to interview were elderly people, long in age. Many of them knew that they weren't well. And so it was important to get their voice, to get their experience, to get their information firsthand. Then that would lead me then to letters, artifacts, other evidence of their life or the life of the person that they're writing about.
You and I previously have spoken about your genealogy. Would you like to chat a bit about that?
Oh my goodness, yes. And if you remember, I said to you that I was so happy to be able to find out things about myself. For an example, I had my DNA done in 2017 out of curiosity after it became popular then to try to find out who are you. So I had mine done, and I found out that I am 84.3% African. Wow. And of that, I am 45.9% Nigerian. I am 29.0% Sierra Leonean. I am 4.2% Kenyan. I am 3%, it just says from Central Africa, 2.1% from North Africa, and in East Europe, I found through research that I am 13.5% Ukrainian.
Wow.
And look at this, 2.2% South Asian. That makes up my 100%. Now, you know that I have not a clue as to where or who these people are to whom I'm related, but the one that of all of these that blew my mind was to find out I was 13.5% Ukrainian, and as the war in Ukrainian emerged, I said, oh my goodness, it kind of tweaks your interest and you want to say, oh, what's going on? I'm 13.5% Ukrainian, and I wanted to substantiate that. My son, I shared this with my older son. He said, Ma, that's interesting. I think I'll have mine done. And his percentages were very close to mine. For an example, I don't remember all of that except when he got to the European part where I'm 13.5%. His was 35 point something, and that's because his father's legacy comes from Caucasian background. So it is great to know your roots, even though you don't have the specificity of who it was. So I really enjoyed learning this information about myself.